light that way?
Yeah, that's
Is
fine.
it-
Mom, do we want to get started?
In one thing,
Yeah.
I've turned up the air conditioner. Is it bothering?
No, it's fine. Thanks.
I, of course, should not make this whole period sound like a fresh air front trip. We all lost weight. We went down to, I was on 75 pounds. I think most people were around there. The tall people also got to that level, and some of them started stealing from us, and I was put in an unpleasant position of judging, which I hated, and I figured out that they couldn't help it. They were tall and they lost more.
And this was, and you knew your weight because you actually had weigh-ins at the camp?
Yeah, very rarely, but we did have one or two.
Did you have physical examinations also, or?
No,
Or that
hardly.
was, yeah. And the weight information, you don't know what they did with that? It was
No.
just, it's not that they could increase food for anybody.
They had photographs of us, and I would love to have mine, but I hate to ask to bother the Japanese government for my picture. I made a self-portrait. I had a beard when I arrived in Osaka, but one of the guards started hanging from my beard to indicate that it shouldn't be there, so I shaved it off. And we lost about 25% of people, mostly from pneumonia. And we had a period, but we got beriberi. I got it too, rather suddenly. If you lose the power of your legs, and that's it. And I still have some leftover symptoms. It is true that if you all are in the same position, you don't realize that much. We had a vague impression that the Japanese were getting fatter, but it was in relation to ourselves, probably.
How did their food and their treatment of their own people, the guards, and differ from what you could see anyway? Differ from the way the prisoners were treated?
Their treatment, not that much. They would beat each other up when they felt it was necessary, and they beat us up maybe a little more than that. The food we had no occasion to see. We never got meat, we got bones sometimes, and I helped to arrange them in size so everybody would get the same amount of bone. And I had taken it on myself to make a menu with cards that could be slipped in that said blood or whale blubber or whatever we got. And water, hot water or no hot water to drink.
You had, I remember you'd also told a story of how you would make up food combinations of different things just to...
Because of their hunger, and for people who haven't had real hunger, it's so hard to describe. It is not pain in your stomach or anything. It's a craving for food mostly. And I, who never cooked in my life, decided to make a table, vertical and horizontal, of things that I liked that I could sandwich between other things I liked. And it led to rather strange combinations, like a sandwich of whole jam with apple in between, stuff like that. There were people who had been cooks who came home after the war with these delicious recipes, and they started making them, and they were disgusting, because what is tasteful in war is horrible in peacetime. I could go on to.
I think if we're starting to talk about how you found out that the war was
yes, I could
coming to a conclusion.
I could fit in this man whom I met here in Fort Worth, who was in the squadron of B-29s, these are big bombers, that bombed us, and they were flying very low when it happened. I was sick. I was not in my own barracks, which was a good thing because one incendiary bomb was dropped at the foot of my bed, where I probably would have been if I had been well. But during that raid, there was some fire on the roofs, and I could see from my bed people climbing on the roofs with blankets and killing the flames, and then started to wave at the planes, which was not exactly what the Japanese wanted us to do. There was in Osaka an outhouse, a toilet that we could use, and they didn't have toilet paper, of course. They had cut up rectangles of newspaper. And one day I went there, and the top sheet had a map that showed something called Ingurandu and another thing called Furanshi. So I knew what those were, and a little piece of Normandy was shaded. That's where it was printed. So I got very excited, and my friends it didn't penetrate to them, I think. But 2 weeks later I had to go again, and again there was a top sheet, and a big piece of Normandy was shaded. So I had two conclusions. One is that there was no coincidence, and that probably the Japanese Marines who shared the dry dock facilities put it there for us to find. And the other one is that the Japanese were pretty well informed about some things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then we were, when Osaka was bombed, we thought that would be the end of our work in the dry docks, which was pretty heavy. But no, the dry docks were all intact, and the target was the wooden houses of the people of Osaka. Well, then we went to Nagaoka by train, and I made some sketches of the view. Some were beautiful, not the sketches, the views. And in Nagaoka we were put in a wooden barracks, and we worked in a carbide factory. And I had one guard, Kajiyama-san, who was, I think, my friend. He was very good to us, actually, though he was very strict. His facial expression never changed. We once asked him, well, we didn't speak Japanese, he didn't speak English, but somehow we said, why was he not fighting? So he took his cane and made two lines in the sand. So that was him. Then he made a line like that, which obviously was his colon. And he made a cross through his transverse colon, so that had been removed. And I asked him if they put it together. He said yes. But he died shortly after the war.
Mm-hmm. Is he the one that you tried to maintain contact with after the war?
I got this letter from his son eventually, who said, "My father often told me about the good times he had with you and your colleagues."
Mm. But that letter from his son was fairly recent, wasn't that?
Yeah, a couple of years ago.
That was something that the sister cities in Fort Worth had helped
yeah, just remarkable.
track him down.
Fort Worth has three, I think, sister cities. One was Bandung, where I was captured in Indonesia. Then there was Nagaoka, where I was liberated. Well, and the Americans started dropping food on colored parachutes, and people cut up the parachutes and made a Dutch flag and an American flag out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were taken by train. They put the Dutch flag in front of the train, a locomotive, and we got to
But this is after liberation?
After
or?
liberation. We got to a city, and I keep forgetting whether it was...
Well, how did you know you'd been liberated? I mean, what was the communication there?
Oh, well, Heinrich. He was a Japanese soldier who spoke some German, so we called him Heinrich. And one day Heinrich came...
Did you, to his face or behind his back? You called him that?
Well, he wouldn't have minded, I think. And he came to us and he said, soon the day shift will come home from the factory because the war is over. And we had heard so many rumors, and we created some ourselves, some rather silly. And sometimes they came back to us as truth, you know. But then they came, and so the war is over, and we were called up to the area where the captain, the Japanese captain, who often walked around naked with a sword on his side, he gave a speech to tell us the war was over, but he forgot to tell us who won. We guessed. And but the touching scene was, this was close to the Queen Wilhelmina's birthday. And so when the food was dropped, they made a meal that everybody got sick from. But the area was decorated with these colored flags made from the parachutes. We got flowers from the factory girls, wildflowers they picked somewhere, and we had a burnt out incendiary bomb and the flowers were in it.
Oh.
Good old days.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, you want to go over to...
Yeah, I think if we could talk a little bit about what was going on meanwhile in Holland during the war.
I think you should also say that you went to, what was it?
Oh yeah,
How you came back to the civilized world, so to speak.
all right.
That was after liberation?
Yes.
Okay.
There's one remarkable thing that happened to us when we went through a very efficient treatment. We had, you know, in Indonesia we had bed bugs. Then in Shanghai the bed bugs were removed by the ants, and in Osaka we had lice, and then in Nagaoka we had fleas. And the first thing that the Americans did to us is to spray us with DDT, give us new uniforms, of course, and then we were interrogated, and x-rays were taken, and by the time we were through with their questions, the report came back, and we would either go to a hospital ship or Atsugi Airport. And we went to the airport by truck, and there was a plane waiting, a pilot who, all these Americans looked tremendous, and muscles all over the place. He had this box of food and handed it to me and said, please take this into the plane. I couldn't carry it, so I asked one of my friends to carry it, and I still remember the pilot saying, oh, for Pete's sake, and he took the box and the tears were running down his cheeks. What the hell is wrong with this? Is supposed to be a pilot, they shouldn't cry, but that was because the way we looked, apparently.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, it just, to him it was nothing to lift up his box and the tube. You were so weak you couldn't
do it.
Yeah.
You went to the island where the atomic bomb fell, right?
No, I went to Okinawa, and first, and then from there to Manila. And we gained weight rapidly. Well,
and you stayed, how long did you stay in Manila?
I stayed, for months, I think, at least. I found...
was that on an American base, or what?
Yes, and there was a Red Cross place where I found a fat science book. And I had invented, when I was recovering from pneumonia, I invented a few things. One was an X-ray machine with a bass and a quartz thread that rotated so you could focus the X-rays. And another one was a microscope zoo, a series of microscopes, and you project, make sure to cool the stages and project paramecium and volvox and rotifers and interesting beasties. I don't know if that was ever done by anybody.
There's one thing that I wanted to bring up before we go to talking about what was going on in Europe and in Holland during that same period. You had said something once about your father being a physics teacher, talking about the power in the atom.
I forgot about that. When when the first planes flew over to B-20 to drop food, we had one sergeant first class or so who knew signals. He took off his shirt and he waved in a certain way to these planes. And one of the B-29s came back and dropped something tied to his stick, and it was an issue of life and also an overseas Times. And in it there was a note that Mr. Truman had said there was a very special new kind of bomb using the atom. My father had the habit of, in the last class he gave, to talk about quantum theory even, and atom structure, and he said that if they ever get the energy out of the atom, the world could be ending. So when I read that, I said, my God, they did it.
And when you said, my God, was it a combination of awe and fear that...
Mostly
awe that they were actually able to do it, and then realizing
yes.
what...
Yeah, I think the same feeling in that the actual people who were involved about once it exploded.
Yeah, and as a scientist it presented an interesting, almost an intellectual challenge.
Yeah.
And yet the reality of it was far beyond what I think people imagined.
And they were just unable to stop. Well, as a scientist, you don't stop easily.
Yeah, and it's still going on.
Yeah.
So we'll leave you in Manila for now.
Okay.
And where you're fattening up.
Yes.
And
getting
Mom,
ready to fight Indonesia.
Can we talk about what was going on in Holland then?
Okay. Yeah. Well, as I said, in the beginning the Germans went very slowly, and it really, what they did was outrageous in a way, but it was so little that a lot of people said, are we going to go on strike for this? And towards the end that changed, but they were really masterful that way, and they registered everything, and their real main purpose was, from what we could see, to rid Holland from the Jews and the homosexuals and the people and the gypsies.
Even Catholics.
And Catholics.
And no, not really. The Catholics were very unpopular because I think anything worldwide they didn't trust. And it turned out that in Utrecht we had a bishop who was very involved in, not necessarily in opposition, but in trying to make people help each other. And I remember that one day our grocer came with a little basket, and he had different things that were hard to get. And he said, the bishop told us we should help each other, and you can have this. Well, not, we paid for it, but they were almost impossible to get.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of things were they?
Even things that were on the bonnet, you know, the
Contraband.
No, no, on the food.
on the food. Well, we had little seals, you know, that you had to hand in.
Sort of like food rationing coupons
Yeah,
or something.
rationing.
Coupons,
Yeah, rationing coupons.
And very often, even the coupon things you couldn't get. And, you know, sometimes you had things for bread, and then you came and the bread was gone, or they had material that didn't work very well, and there was a big hole in the bread, or the inside of the bread was soggy or something like that. Now what we did was they had, how do you call those, gaarkeukens? Well, food
distribution
lines,
kitchens.
food distributions.
Well, soup kitchens.
Soup kitchens, that's
Soup,
what it
yeah.
was. It was mostly soup. And we had coupons for all kinds of food, and we had to hand them in, and then we could get other coupons to get a portion. And in those days there were secret printing presses who were able to make lots
Forgeries?
of extra coupons.
Yeah.
And my mother bought a few of those, so we had, instead of 3 or 2 portions, maybe we had 4.
Mm-hmm.
And I went then, and I had a pan, and that was this isolated with towels and insulated and well, there were no newspapers. But anyway, and then we went home, and we had a very small thing that really was invented by the Boy Scouts, and it was a way of making heat and cook with an extremely small amount of fuel, and we had one like that, and we could heat it up, and we could heat water.
Now it was officially just you and your mother living there, and your brother was, so you only had rations for 2 people.
Yes, but
and you had to share.
We bought extra rations.
And your younger brother, what was he doing by this time?
My younger brother, there was a work project that the Germans had in the part of this inland sea that they were making dry and make farmland of. But it had to be planted, and things had to be done with it, and they had not enough people to do that. And the idea was, of course, to plant things that they could use in Germany mostly. And they were asking for people to work there, and that's what my brother did. And then from there he kind of slowly disappeared into
the underground.
Underground, and he belonged to a group that was very aggressive, and apparently he did kill a couple of German soldiers.
But he didn't really talk about it later.
He never talked about it, but he lived as a farmer, and he was well fed.
Mm-hmm.
And
now, wasn't he captured also?
No, he was never captured.
No, but he escaped from the train.
Well, that was much earlier, when he was still a student.
Oh.
One day he was rounded up and was put in a train and moved on to Amersfoort, which was the center of all the trains that went to Germany with people. And, they were just, robbed from the street. I think he had been swimming or something like that. and he was a little train that went from Utrecht to that place, and it was one of these locals, and it was a trip that he had taken when he played, I think he played water polo or something.
Oh, yeah.
And he knew that there was a certain spot where the train had to slow down and then all of a sudden pull up again. And he stood where he could jump out of the train, so that's what he did. But anyway, he was kind of safe, and he was in hiding, but there were raids that this group did, and they came into the cities and did all kinds of stuff. And apparently he told my father about it, but never anybody else. And when we were, I had also received a notice that I was a parasite and that I should, go and get a job or something, or do some work for Mr. Peasants or farmers or something. And so I figured that as long as I had a job, preferably something useful, they wouldn't touch me. And I went to an aunt of mine in another village, and she didn't need any help, but her dentist did. He just lost his maid, and so they interviewed me, and they said they would take me. They were pretty desperate, I think. Now I thought I knew something about housekeeping. I was totally wrong. And in the beginning, my boss lady worked with me to show me how to do it, and once I knew it, she stopped doing that, and I had to do it all myself, and it was pretty heavy work.
But they had a special needs daughter?
Yes, they did, and she had spina bifida, and she was a very small, frail child. No, she's no longer that frail, but
You're still in touch with her, which is
oh yeah, I'm
very
still in touch with
special.
her. And she was able to walk, not very well, but she could walk, and she could bicycle, but not up a hill. So I had to push her to her school, but she could come home by herself. And I noticed that her mother was a very interesting woman. I think I really liked her very much. And she had, the way she treated her child was that there were things she couldn't help. Like she couldn't help that she was not, that she was incontinent at night. And before I went to bed, I had to put a new diaper on her. And she was about 10 by that time. But during the day, she knew when she would have a bowel movement, and she was supposed to immediately go to the toilet. And if she didn't, then she was berated, and she said, listen, you know how to do it, and you should. And so basically she was taught that there were things she couldn't help, and that was okay, but the things that she could help, she was supposed to take care of.
And she eventually, what degree did she get? She's an attorney, or
she got a law degree, and she was also involved in social work.
Mm-hmm.
And I met her again thanks to, I think, one of my poetry books that she found out about, and she wrote to me, and we still correspond.
Now, so did you work there for the duration? Because the
No,
university was closed then at that
yeah,
point.
university.
And
was
did you
closed.
work for them for the duration of the
No,
war at
I
that
didn't.
point?
I
or-
think I went in late '43, and I think in the summer of '44, I realized that all this threatening of the female students was just bluff. They never followed through on it. And by that time my mother was by herself and she had my brother at home, and it was a difficult time for her, so I said that I was going to go back home.
So you worked for them for how long?
Almost a year.
Yeah.
Well, I learned a lot,
Yeah.
and it was not totally wonderful, but it was bearable, and they were very nice, decent people.
And then, meanwhile, what was happening with the other side of the family? With
Well, my brother was.
well, no, with Daddy's side of the family.
Well, Leo's mother. Well, the first thing was, that they had to get these identity cards, and then they started being limited in what they could do. And one of the things was, and his father was prematurely pensioned, and they had a curfew at night, which we didn't have. Later we also got that. And by and large, they were evacuating all the Jews that lived near the ocean. I think they were afraid that they would help an English invasion or whatever. And they were all sent to the nearest city with a certain distance, and Gouda was one of the cities, and there was a real influx of Jews from The Hague and places that were along the coast. And it was, in a way, the Jewish community kind of prospered a little bit for a while. They had interesting people, and it was a real very small community. Leo's mother was very active in the Jewish community. She was also very active in social work, which in those days was partly done by volunteers. And so she was and she also worked, she was on the board of a old people's home for Jewish people, and also for a farm where children were raised to become pioneers in Israel and go to the kibbutz. And
This was Sapta who was on.
Yeah.
Sapta was on this board. Yeah.
Yeah, she's on that board. And
Did she get involved in that through her sister-in-law,
sister-in-law.
Tante Bets?
Tante Bets?
No, not at all. Had nothing to do. Tante Bets didn't do that kind of thing.
Okay.
Tante Bets was in the what is called
The Witzo.
the Ritzo, which is the well, that's a different name here.
It's the Hadassah.
The
isn't it?
Hadassah.
Yeah.
And she also, Tante Bets was also, she and Uncle Leo moved from their apartment to a what is een weeshuis?
Orphanage.
An orphanage for Jewish girls, where they were taught to be helpers to be household helpers. The ambition wasn't very high for these girls. I think there were some exceptions, but basically they were just told to make themselves useful and make a living that way. When she was on the board of directors, and I have a printout of her diary of the time that she was there, and also how they were able for a long time to prevent the orphanage to be raided, but eventually they did. And she ended up in a camp, and her husband was in hiding, and when he found out, he made sure that he ended up in the same camp. And eventually they were exchanged because of the membership of the Hadassah with prisoners of war, German prisoners of war.
And where did they,
And
when they were exchanged, where did they go?
They went to Israel, which was Palestine.
And when were they exchanged?
I think in 1940 something.
Well,
So early? No.
no. When was it? What year?
That's what I'm
1940?
saying.
No.
1944 or something.
44.
Okay,
yeah.
all right.
I was
Yeah.
looking for the last.
Yeah. But
So-
then Sapta, meanwhile.
But Sapta happened. She was living in her house. Her husband had died. She had a little very young girl to help her, and eventually I think. I think she stayed until the last moment, and I visited her quite often. And one time,
When she was at home still?
her home,
Yeah.
yes. And one day she said to me, "Do you really want to do that? Because it's forbidden." And I felt, why shouldn't I? And what happened was that I was there, and she had some people that were supportive of her, mostly because of either her own work or the position of Leo's father, and non-Jews, and they kind of tried to help her. And but one day I happened to be staying with her. The Germans came and said, "Get out of your house." And within a few hours she had to pack up, and fortunately she could go to the old people's home, where also an uncle of Leo and his wife were, that also being put out of their house. And I visited her there, and I could spend the night with one of her neighbors. And that lasted for quite a while, and then I'm not totally sure whether I was still there. Oh yes, and what happened was that the Germans had demanded of the Jews to band together and form or put a kind of what should I say, a committees in charge of the Jews of certain areas, which was called the Jewish Council. And they let that council do all kinds of things, like they were also able to put Jews on a list that would so-called protect them, and usually it did not protect them. But there was a particular list for Jews who had provided a great service to the government of Holland, not to the Germans, but to the Dutch government. And people who knew her had first offered her a hiding address, and she said no, she didn't want to do that because she didn't want to put people into danger. But when she was offered to be put on that other list, which was called the Frederick's list, I don't know why. Frederick is
a guy.
It's like Fred, you know, and she was put on that list on the force of, on the strength of the position of Leo's father, because he was an assistant principal, and he worked in two schools, and she accepted. She said, why not? Well, it turned out that saved her life later, because everybody on that list was safe.
But she didn't tell us she went to
well, she still had to go.
At what point did she give you her coat and her ring?
Oh, that happened. I think at one point, Sapta said, "Could you keep my fur coat?" And so I said, I could do that. And then she gave me her ring, which was really a ring that was made from one of the earrings of her mother, and her sister had another ring, which I think they barely knew that they have, but it was very important for Sapta. She always wore that ring. So I saved those two things for her. We just put them in a box.
Was that when she was put out of her house, or after?
No, that was before.
Before that?
Yeah.
But
I think it was before that.
But you missed the what camp she went to.
No, that's coming. And then, because of that being put on that list, she was supposed to go to a camp. So she went to that camp, and I was able to visit her there. And she couldn't get out, or some people could get a leave to get out sometimes. And it was like a vacation colony, more or less. It was very crowded, but they had not much room, but a lot of company and a lot of family. A lot of Sapta's family was also in that camp.
What kind of facility was it? Was it?
That camp was a large farmhouse, and there was another camp that was more special, that belonged with it, and that was an old castle. And then all of a sudden she was moved to another camp, which was the camp of Westerbork. And that was a camp that was a camp from where people would go to all kinds of camps, either camps that were not all that bad, or camps where they would be killed.
So sort of a staging area in a way.
Yeah. And she went and she was sent to the camp in Terbesin, and I think it has Trebesin, it was also called.
Trebenka?
It was
Iteration stuff.
Yeah, it was Teresian stuff. But Teresian was the Czech name for that. And she was in that camp. As long as she was in the camp in between, we could send her things, And one of Leo's father's friends and his sister, you could send them to him, and then he would send them to somebody, the husband of the housekeeper of your Aunt Betsy, and he would send it to the camp. And you know, things like soap or coffee.
And my shoes.
And then she wanted cigarettes.
Oh.
And she had a friend who said, why did she take cigarettes? What can she possibly think about? And she didn't realize that they were money, you know.
In Japan also.
Yeah.
But
And didn't she cook also in the camp?
oh yes, it was all, a lot of the work was done by volunteers, and Sapta, who loved cooking, and she took all the kind of leftovers, like the leaves that were not totally perfect, and the peels of potatoes, and she made soup. And the soup was sold for, I think, a dime a cup, and that they used for something else. And she had frankly, she had a great time.
Not exactly.
Sapta was somebody who could live in the here now.
Yeah.
And then, you know.
So when she was released from camp, how did that happen?
Well, she told us later, the war was already over in Holland, I think. But no, that was not true. No, it was January. It was not over yet. But the Allies were conquering large pieces of Europe again.
France.
But France and so. But the war was not over yet. She got the order to pack a suitcase and to go to the little station that belonged to that camp. And usually this was a transit camp where she was. But she didn't know what was going to happen, but you know, what else could she do? So she did, and it turned out that eventually she got into a train, and the train went to Switzerland. And that was specifically that group of people that were on that list that were also, there were also other people, but almost all these people that were on that list were saved that way.
And this was the list of people who had performed special service to the Dutch government.
Country. So there are a lot of things. I have a book that goes into that, but not very clearly, because there were things that you just couldn't.
So when was that she went to Switzerland?
That was I think in January, or it was, I think, January or
Of
something.
45.
45.
And she stayed there for the duration of the war.
And I think I knew somehow. I think I knew about it. And so she was in Switzerland, and they were sent to big hotels that they would not leave the grounds of. But Uncle Leo, who always went to Switzerland in the winter, and had a good friend in another real hotel, managed to get her an invitation to go to that hotel, and she was totally pampered there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Switzerland was the place where we always went for summer vacation.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of going from a concentration camp to the summer vacation land.
Yeah.
Well,
but what happened to some of the other people in Daddy's family?
I want to say one more thing. When the war was over, she was given a choice. Where did she want to go? And she could go to Holland, but she also could go to Palestine. and she said that that's what she chose because she had no more family really anymore. And what did you ask me?
But did she go directly from Switzerland then to Palestine?
Yes,
and then I know that there are other people in the family who did not survive.
No, they didn't.
And did you find out during the war or after? How did you find out who survived and who didn't?
Well, I think there were records and they were available, and Sapta was able to find out. Now her father's sister was a teacher, and she also lived in Gouda, and she also was moved to that house of the old people's home, and the relationship between the two of them was not very good. She felt that Sapta was not the right wife for her brother.
And which aunt was this?
Tante Saartje.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I liked her very much, but she had nothing against me. And when Sapta was put on that list, she was wondering that she had been a teacher, couldn't she go on that list? And she couldn't. And it was nothing to do with Sapta.
Mm.
But she was very bitter about it all. And then at one time I was visiting Sapta, and I was on a station where I had to change to a local train. And while I was waiting, a train rolled onto the station, and somebody opened one of those windows, and it was the head of the how do you call it? The director of the house of the old people's home, a woman that I knew, and she saw me stand. She opened the window, and she waved at me, and so I went up to the window, and she said, "We're going to Westerbork."
Mm-hmm.
And so and apparently they had emptied the house,
mm-hmm.
and Tante Saartje was able to escape, and she drowned herself.
So she's the one who jumped off
in
the
canal.
And that was a canal in Gouda?
That was in front of
the home.
Of the home.
In Gouda?
Yeah.
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 Mm-hmm. And then the family of Leo's father, I think most of them did not survive. There was a rabbi and his son and his wife and his daughter did not survive. But the children of the daughter did survive, and they had been put into the care of a Catholic family, and her name was Truida, and Truida was becoming interested in the Catholic religion, and she asked to be taught more about it, and she had a very sympathetic priest,
Mm-hmm.
and by the time he was finished, she said, "I want to be a Catholic." And she wrote to her father, and her father, who was a rabbi, said, "If that's what you want, do it." but it didn't save her, and she was killed eventually. But the two children were really sent from one family to another. Eventually, after the war, there had to be a decision made what to do with them. And Trude had written a letter to Leo's mother because she met her in that last camp. And in that letter she said, I want my children to be raised as Catholics. And after the war, the Jewish community was trying to find these, children that had no parents and see what they could do with them and save them, because the whole group was decimated. And there was a law case whether that they would allow these children to be adopted by non-Jews. And Leo's mother testified, and she said this was the wish of the mother.
Mm.
And frankly, I have some correspondence with one of those children.
And you still have, or?
Yeah, well, we have corresponded, we stopped, but I still have his address.
Now, were there also, I thought there was a story about two young children who had run out into the street and
that's
disappeared?
my friend Baptist I was talking about.
Oh, your cousin?
And his two sisters. Of course, they had to wear these yellow stars, and there was some noise in the street. They were curious. They were ran out without the stars and never came back. We don't know what happened to them.
And
So that was your cousin Bertus and his two
And
sisters?
his two sisters.
Yeah. How old were they?
Oh,
My age.
yeah, they were
The late teens?
young adults.
Young
Yeah,
adults?
yeah.
Yeah.
They were all sent to this ghetto in Amsterdam, and they had a lot of friends, and they had a good time, and they were not watching themselves. And after curfew, they were on the streets.
Mm.
And Leo's uncle, really the nephew of your father, he was in hiding with his wife, and his wife died of cancer. And after the war, he came back to his house in his uncle Simon,
Mm-hmm.
and he got married to the director of the house, and she was our aunt really.
Mm.
Changed his life.
And she
Now, was it the director of the house who waved from the
Yeah.
window?
Yeah.
Oh.
Because she survived also.
Mm-hmm. And when
But most relatives of Sapta survived.
mm-hmm.
We
And
have
most relatives of your grandfather died.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the family branch on my mother's side was mostly Sephardic. Those are the Jews that had come from Portugal,
Mm-hmm.
and they had Portuguese names. Very often, like Helene, I have a picture of her there who was
You
an
mean
actress.
the Jews on your father's side?
No, this is my mother's side.
On your mother's side?
And they survived. They were more adventurous and upbeat, while on my father's side were mostly Ashkenazim,
Mm-hmm.
originally from
The
Eastern Europe.
yeah.
They were easily depressed and worried and afraid, and they died.
Yeah, but they also didn't have fancy occupations, because
Yeah.
the relatives of your mother, they were doctors and on the other side they were
More working class.
more
Yeah.
working class.
And then the liberation, maybe we'll just come up to liberation and then we'll take a break, and that gets us kind of back to a parallel time.
Well, I think in the meantime, the Germans, although they also had far from a very sufficient life in Germany, really was so angry about the, I think I told you about the Arnhem business. No, I didn't. Well, at one time, the army was going through Europe and conquering all the countries.
The American.
France.
Which army?
The American.
The Allies?
The Allies, France, and also the south of Holland up to the rivers, because the rivers were a big. And the Germans had opened the rivers up, so there was a lot of water that they couldn't go through, and they could go around it to the north, the northeast, and there they actually fought, and that was, I think, the only place where they actually fought in that part of the war. But they were getting across the river, but it was a comparatively small group, and they were dropping soldiers, and they just couldn't get together to be sufficient to hold Arnhem, and they were totally well, I don't think much less was left of them. But in the meantime, the West, where we lived, knew about it, and because they couldn't keep it a secret, and the windows opened and the doors opened, and young men were on the streets who were really hiding, dancing, and the Germans were packing up, and then all of a sudden the whole thing turned, and the Germans were able to stop it, but they didn't forgive it. And they really took revenge on the west part of Holland.
In what way?
We had famine. We really had famine. And I remember when my brother came home after the war was over, he walked from where he had worked, losing his papers on the way and getting them back in the mail. And he opened the door, and there he was, and he looked at us, and later he said, "You look terrible. You were very, very skinny."
Mm-hmm.
And
but that thing was the Brussels sprout.
oh no, that was that it's just. Once I had gone out to get some food from the farmers, and didn't get any, and on the way home I saw Brussels sprout lying on the street and picked it up, and it went into the soup, because my mother also cooked a little bit, but not very much.
Yeah.
And
but back to the liberation.
well, I think what the Germans did, and the Americans, mostly the Americans did, they parachuted supplies down, and they somehow, were divided, and there was a lot of spam and a lot of herring and stuff like that, canned stuff, and also those biscuits, those very hard biscuits, which were not supposed to be eaten, but supposed to be worked into cereal, hot cereal.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't know that, and tried to eat it and broke their teeth.
Oh. But with the, did you, since you were vegetarian, did you eat any of the
Yes, we
meat?
did.
Because that was, you had no
we
choice
felt
really.
that we should do. And also they handed out a lot of cigarettes. And my brother, Ed, he was in really a kind of bad state, he had been spoke harder than a whisper for up 2 years almost. And he was very nervous, and we said, "Why don't you take a cigarette?" Well, he didn't stop.
Mm.
And the same thing with my other brother, but for other reasons. And
Killed them
so,
both.
and it took a couple of months before the universities opened again. And as I said,
Did you hear from me in that time?
Well,
yes,
but
I
but
had heard from you.
could we get back to the actual liberation of when of the end of the war and the troops that came in and
Well, it was, as I said, you know, we heard it on the radio, we saw planes dropping things, and people were handing out, trying to make a good distribution so that not people got everything and other people got nothing. And they had a distribution system during the war, and all you got was some. I think we mostly got coupons for bread and coupons for oil, and that was about it.
Yeah. The soldiers that came in, though, you had said that you didn't have any real knowledge of or any belief that anyone other than the English were coming in to liberate Holland, and what was
Well, what I did was the soldiers were, frankly, turned out to be Canadians. We were, it was all Canadians. We didn't even know that Canadians were in the war. And so it was announced that Canadian Army would, you know, enter Utrecht, and I went where I could see them. And I had also gone where I could see the Germans enter, and the Germans had
Horse-drawn.
horse-drawn primitive. They had tanks and they had horse-drawn little wagons.
is this when they were leaving
No, when
When they came.
when they came in.
and when they invaded?
Yeah.
You know, when
With
they
horses.
were taking when they just
Invaded.
were entering
Yeah.
for keeps. And so I went to see that, and I went to the same place to see the Allies, and that there was not a horse to be seen.
Yeah.
And
There's
it
no
was,
comparison.
It was tanks and tanks and tanks. It was very impressive.
But they were Canadians, and they were upset that they were called Tommies.
Well, you know, we didn't know about Canadians, and we didn't know about the Americans either. You know, in theory we knew. Well, you know, I think there's a lot of vanity involved, and here you probably heard very little about what the Canadians. Oh, maybe Canadians, but what the British did. And we heard almost nothing about the Americans.
So when did, I'd like to just cover the sequence of events of when you found out that Daddy had actually survived the camp. Because you were sending him cards or things that he never got.
That's right.
Through the Red Cross?
The Red Cross allowed a postcard with, I think, 20 words. And I had...
Every 2 weeks?
Every 2 weeks. And I had received a postcard from Indonesia. And by that time, frankly, we were already in Japan. Because I heard later from somebody who worked for the Red Cross that that's what they did. They waited until the people were moved to send you the postcard that came from the previous place. So I got one postcard from Osaka, and you were already in Nagaoka. And I got one postcard from Indonesia and you were already in Singapore.
And I got nothing. But the Americans sometimes got letters, and I remember one guy in our group, it was in January. Wow, this is from Christmas. Look at, oh wait, that's not this Christmas then.
Aww. So you knew that up to a certain point he had survived.
I knew that when I get a card, they were not dated.
Mm.
When I got a card, I knew at least that he had been alive and there, but I thought he was still there. And now what exactly? Well, what happened was that well, Holland was already free because we were the European War, and the war with Japan lasted about half a year longer, until August. And I got a telegram, and the telegram came from America, and it was sent by your cousin
Ernst
Snapper. And then later I got also something from you yourself.
But what did the telegram say?
I don't remember.
I mean, the gist of it was that.
Was alive?
Yeah, that you were alive and how are you, you know.
And so how did Ernst know that you had survived the camp?
Because when I, as I described, when it was processed by the Americans, was allowed to send one message.
Is this when you were in Manila? Or before you got to?
Before that. It was,
Okinawa.
no, in Japan. And that was passed through, apparently.
And that was the message you sent to Ernst?
I also got, you sent a message, because then he didn't know where I was.
Yeah, but you knew that Ernst was in America, so had not been as affected by the activities in Europe.
But obviously. I also sent a message to a professor that I knew was a very nice guy, Professor Booker, to try to inform.
And he did. He sent it on to me.
This Uncle Snapper was at that time in China. He was kind of a big shot medical guy. Was put there by the Rockefeller Foundation. And one day I said, pick that up, and I got in the mail from Holland via China this magazine.
No, when did you get this?
This was in 1941. Can you see it?
Open the first page.
It's too dark to see that.
No, I'll open the first page, maybe you'll see that.
I'll put that light on.
Oh.
Yeah. Hard work.
This magazine opened with poems by me, and this was my first publication of poetry.
Now, these were poems that were written when? Before the war.
Yeah.
And this was published before the war as well?
That was in the middle of the war, 1940, March 1941, under the German eyes. And what is interesting is, if you look, there's a footnote behind my name. And on the bottom of the page says that I was the illustrator of the comic strip Stima and Stama for the newspaper, NRC, to identify me. That was a weird sense. It was my very first poetry publication. Went uphill from there.
And this Hrasov was the man that you met in Cape Town. So But back to the story of,
Getting together?
well, no, I don't want to go into that right now, but you found out initially from Ernst
I think
and,
I think from Ernst Stopper and from the professor,
mhm.
and and then uh, I don't know exactly what happened. I think I got the Red Cross gave me an address in Australia for you, and I sent a letter
Yeah,
there.
it was a neutral address, and then they knew where I was, and
And was that when you were in
I
Manila?
got it in Manila.
Okay.
The first real contact.
I always had your soldier number,
Oh yes.
and that was about
Mhm.
5 or 6,
Yeah.
and I always had to put that on.
But at that point, you still had not had direct
No.
other than that letter, there was no direct
But
contact.
I think once you were in Manila, we could write to each other, I think.
I think
Yeah.
a little bit,
Yeah.
yes.
Yes, and then once you were fattened up, you
Mhm.
you got permission to go back to Holland, which was not
Well,
Mhm.
that was not
Yeah.
a natural thing to expect, because he was a member of the Indonesian,
Yeah.
Dutch Indonesian army, but a distant cousin of.
it's finished.
Mhm. No. Yeah. Well, now I'd like to, finish up with what
What happened after?
with what was in Manila, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll
Um,
continue with the next stage.
I was, when we were fattened up, the Dutch government said, now you're ready to fight the Indonesians because there's an uprising. So I went to the lieutenant that was kind of drafting me, and I said, if you give me a rifle, I'll shoot my officer first. That's the first thing I'll do. And he thought a moment and said, well, in that case you can go to Holland.
Hmm.
And they sent me via the United States.